Okay, good morning, I think, still, everyone. So I'd like to take a little bit of a liberty here and take you out of the forest, because remarkably, we do conservation outside of forests too. And the interesting thing is that when we try and do impact evaluation, it turns out that some of the characteristics of the system that we work in don't really matter. We find the same challenges whether we have wet feet or whether we have leaves above our heads. So what I'd like to do today is talk to you about some work that my colleagues and I have been doing to measure the social impacts of marine protected areas in Indonesia. And this is work that I've been doing with Mike Marsha at WWF, as well as some colleagues at the State University of Papua, or UNIPA. So why is this relevant for you forest folks? Well, marine systems and forests are surprisingly similar, both from the ecological processes that shape ecosystem structure and function, through to their political economy, as well as how we conserve them. So things that we learn in one system are in many ways transferable to other systems. So just like their terrestrial counterparts, marine protected areas are the most widely used tool for marine conservation in the world. They currently cover about 13% of all ocean, predominantly in coastal areas, at least by number, although there are a few sizable pelagic MPAs. And MPAs are spreading rapidly. There are currently targets to increase MPA extent to 20% by 2030. So we're looking at a substantial increase in the area under these types of interventions in the coming years. And this matters because a sizable proportion of the world's population lives on the coastline. And a sizable proportion of the world's poor depend on marine protein as their sole source of protein. So what we do in coastal fisheries and what we do in marine conservation can have substantive impacts on the health and the well-being of millions of people. So it's important that we understand the impacts of these things. And just like in terrestrial systems, when we establish new interventions, we like to give them new names. So marine protected areas are called everything from marine reserves to locally managed marine areas to sanctuaries, but in reality, the causal mechanism and our theory of change for these interventions is about the same. So forgive the slightly bodged PowerPoint cartoon. It turns out PowerPoint isn't the best media for cartoons. So what we have here is a coastal marine system. You have industrial scale fishers and small scale fishers, all of whom are catching fish of various different species. Now what we do when we establish a marine protected area is that we place new rules and regulations on a spatially defined area. So what we do effectively is reshape property rights over resources. And in most marine protected areas around the world, we're thinking not about strict protection, but more about sustainable use. So what tends to happen is that these big boats, the large-scale industrial fishers, get kicked out, and either get kicked out beyond the coastal waters, or in some case, they'll end up fishing the line around the edge of the MPA. The theory of change then says that if we establish a small no-take zone in the middle of the MPA, we'll get more fish, bigger fish, and those fish will spill over for these small-scale local fishers to go and catch. So in theory, we have a relatively simple theory of change that we can analyze. And you'd think it would be fairly straightforward. But it turns out that, like everywhere, understanding the impacts of marine protected areas is hard, and it's precipitated a substantial policy debate. MPA proponents suggest that MPAs generate win-wins, benefiting both fish and fishers, while skeptics argue that MPAs privileges the rights of fish and, in brackets, conservationists, above the needs of local fishermen. Now, the evidence for this is highly variable. In some places, we see ecological and social success. In other places, we see biological success and social failure. But the problem with this evidence base, as you are facing in forest systems, is that it's largely anecdotal. And for most cases, causality is unclear, which means disentangling this argument is becoming increasingly difficult. So in 2009, WWF started thinking about how we might go about measuring the impacts of marine protected areas. And we were interested in several questions. First of all, what are the ecological and social impacts of MPAs? How do they vary? Does it vary across disciplines, so ecological and social? Domains within those, geographies, across space and time? If we do have variations, are there synergies between these outcomes? Are there trade-offs? And how do we deal with equity issues when we design MPAs? And ultimately, because we are a conservation organisation, we want to know what we can do to make this better. So we want to know how we can better design an intervention to deliver the impacts that we see. So we're interested in the governance of the MPA itself, so that we can link the intervention to the impacts that we see on the ground. And our ultimate policy question, and one that's frankly probably decades away from us, is how do we design these things to maximise the social and ecological benefits? Because ultimately that's what we want to achieve here. Now, we've heard a lot in the last 24 hours or so about stories and theories. Well, this is ours, and it draws on the work of the late and very great Ellen Ostrom, and her work on social ecological systems and common pool resource theory. So this is our view of how MPAs work. So basically, the governance of the MPA, which we think about across 4 dimensions, affects how people can use resources, both their legally mandated rights, but also the de facto what happens when you establish an MPA but don't enforce it. Resource use patterns affect ecological condition, and together those things affect social condition. And all of this sits within contextual factors. Now, we're not going to claim that we can measure all of these things, but these are the things that we think about when we're trying to understand this system. So we've been putting that conceptual framework to test in Indonesia. So this is the bird's head seascape of Papua, Indonesia. So called because basically you have a bird's head. You've got the beak at the top there and the neck, and I personally don't see it, but other people tell me it's there. And over the past decade or so, a consortium of NGOs, led by Conservation International, together with the Nature Conservancy and WWF, have been busy establishing marine protected areas in this region, and those are shown on the map. Now, this investment represents the largest marine conservation grant in history, and these are also some of the largest MPAs in Indonesia. So, Teluk Cendrawasih there is the size of Connecticut, for those of you who live in the US. It's the size of Slovenia, for those of you in Europe. Kaimana is Delaware or Luxembourg. So these are substantial marine conservation investments. And why do we have them? Well, the Bird's Head Seascape lies at the heart of the Coral Triangle. It's the epicenter of marine biodiversity. But at the same time, it's also the epicenter of cultural diversity. So in our baseline survey work, we find 300 different ethnic groups in 100 villages. So this is one of the most culturally diverse places on Earth. But people here are also highly dependent on marine resources. Most families survive solely, or depend solely, on marine protein as their sole source of protein. So what we wanted to do was understand the social impacts of these marine protected areas. And so, as we're all doing here, we were thinking about a quasi-experimental impact evaluation. And we're doing this at 6 sites, a site being an MPA and a control pair. And we do repeat monitoring. So we start at baseline and we go back every 2 years. Now, one of the challenges that we have in this region, and that I'll talk a little about later, is data. This is a very data-poor region, so we had to be a little creative in how we did our matching. And so we used a multi-stage matching process to get us to the point where we can actually have household-to-household pairs, so an MPA household matched to a non-MPA household, because we really want to understand the equity of impacts within and among social groups. Now, to do this, we use mixed methods. So we do household surveys. Household surveys gather both quantitative and qualitative data on demographics and human well-being. And importantly, we use power analysis to determine our sample size. Now, this is important because it ensures that we're using our resources effectively. We have enough households that we can say something statistically about them, but we don't waste money by talking to too many people. So at baseline, we've spoken to about 2,400 households. We have a team in the field now, so the number is probably more like 3,500 once you start adding repeat data into that. Now we complement this with a series of focus groups and key informant interviews. And this is where we start linking the intervention, so the MPA, to the impact. So here we're interested in governance. So governance is things like how are decisions made? What are the rules? What are monitoring and enforcement systems like? How do we resolve conflicts? These are the characteristics of the intervention that we can actively change when we establish an intervention that will allow us to shape how an MPA performs in future. And the sampling here is opportunistic because this kind of information isn't held by everyone. It's specialist knowledge. We need to speak to the specialists in each community. At baseline, we've got about 45 focus groups across 100 settlements and about 113 key informants. And what we're doing eventually is getting a census across all 100 settlements. Now, all of this data is not collected by me because of strategic response bias. So having a WWF staffer turn up in a village and say, hey, do you like our MPA? Doesn't tend to provoke honest responses. So we work with the local university, UNIPA, and their field teams do household surveys and the focus groups. And this is important for us because it builds partnership with a local institution that we hope will be able to carry this monitoring long term. This is not something that WWF wants to be doing long term. We want to enable our partners to do it for themselves. Now, as I alluded to earlier, there are a couple of challenges in working in a place like Papua. So what we know about impact evaluation is that it's a very data-hungry technique. Papua is probably one of the worst places to try and use a data-hungry analysis technique anywhere in the world. Government data is non-existent beyond the census, and the census is of patchy quality. So how on earth do we go about matching when we have no data on the covariates that we might want to match on? Well, we play with the system a little bit, and we do a two-step matching process. The first thing we do is ask local experts at the settlement level to tell us about the 4 variables you can see there. And those are variables that, from the literature, we think shape MPA impacts. So that tells us which settlements we're most likely to find similar households to MPA households in. So it allows us to target in our search. And once we have that targeted search, we send out our team to do baseline surveys. And in the baseline survey, we collect the household data that we would need to do household-to-household matching. And that allows us to effectively circumvent the absence of data up front about these communities. And when we look at covariate balance, household-to-household after matching, we see that we get pretty good balance. We still have some issues with education. It turns out that there are a couple of communities where people just like going to school, and so it's really tough to match them, but overall, we're comfortable with the balance that we've got. The second challenge, and one that's a little peculiar, is identifying when to do a baseline. Now, I'm sure most of you are thinking, well, at the beginning, and that's true, but when is that? So, conservation interventions don't turn on and off like light switches. They go through a long process of legal designation, and each of these stages may or may not happen in a particular intervention, and they may happen at different paces. So when on earth do we want to go in and collect baseline data? Well, here we use a functional definition. So we think about all of the different stages an MPA goes through, and we try and understand at the best point to go in to collect data. Because we want to know where the boundaries are so that we don't waste money going to communities that we didn't need to survey, because surveying is so very expensive. So here we look at a baseline window between the point when the boundaries are officially designated, so we know which villages we need to go to, and the point when the zoning plan's established, because once you have zones, you can start enforcement. So in one of our sites, Teluk Maya-Libet, this process from traditional declaration by the customary leader through to MPA enforcement took about 5 years. And we had a baseline window of between 2009 and 2011. So the moment we have boundaries on a map, we can begin to do baseline surveys. And so this is a quick illustration of our data coverage. We have settlements inside the MPA, settlements outside. And what I want to do very quickly is talk to you a little bit about some very early data that we're getting from 2 sites, Cendrawasih and Maya-Libet. So when we look at household well-being, we measure assets because it's notoriously difficult to get accurate measures of income. And so what we see in Cendrawasih National Park is a significant increase in household assets 2 years after our baseline. We see no effect in Maya-Libet. When we look at health, we measure food security, and here we're using a standard USDA scale for food security that's adopted by about 70 countries worldwide. And what we see here is, again, differing impacts between these 2 sites. In Cendrawasih, there's been a significant decrease in food security. In Maya-Libet, there's been a small but significant increase. And the interesting thing in Maya-Libet is that we're effectively seeing less decrease in the MPA versus the control. So we're beginning to perhaps see hints of a safety net function here, of MPAs buffering communities against external change. Now, education is probably the most striking of all of the results that we've seen so far. Across the seascape in MPAs and controls, we're seeing substantial increases in education enrollment. Now, in Maya-Libet, the effect is really very striking. So here we're looking at 12% increase in education enrollment in 2 years. Now, ploughing back through the qualitative data, looking for the story that might help us explain this, what we find is that Conservation International have an education boat called the Calabia. And the Calabia is patrolling Maya-Libet and encouraging kids to learn about the environment and encouraging them to go to school. We're still trying to figure out how we can actually parameterize that to give it a p-value, but we think that's what's happening here. Right now, the Calabia has not been into Cendrawasih, so we think that's why we see the difference. So we also look at marine tenure. So we look at the rights that households have over marine resources, whether they can enter an MPA, harvest resources from it, manage it, exclude others from managing it, and transfer or lease their rights to others. And here we see broad decline across the seascape with significant decrease in Maya-Libet. And finally, and this is probably my favorite of our metrics, just because it's a little oddball. So this is place attachment, and we use it as a measure of culture. Now, place attachment measures the emotional bond that you have to a defined space. So if you think about a house has 4 walls, a roof, some windows. Now think about your childhood home. Has the same 4 walls, same roof, same windows, but you feel some kind of emotional bond to it. What this measure is doing is asking that question about the marine protected area, or in the controls, the usual fishing grounds, versus the rest of the ocean. And what we find here in Cendrawasih is a very small but significant increase, 2 years. So MPAs are improving people's emotional bond to the marine environment. But what we're also finding is that fishers are more emotionally attached to marine protected areas than non-fishers, and fishers who only fish and don't do anything else to sustain themselves are more attached again. So these results are very exciting because this is the first time anyone's tried to measure anything like this in a marine protected area. And it's too early to get too overexcited, but we're pretty keen on this result right now. So what have we learned? Well, the message here is that impact evaluation does so much more than measure impact. By simply monitoring these sites, we're able to inform local zoning processes, government reporting. The government is now using these data to report on their national targets. And And we're able to influence broad-scale planning processes. So the government in this region hadn't realised that people who live on islands are farmers too, so they'd never bothered doing agricultural extension work. Now they are, because they've seen the data and they've started working there. And at the national and international level, we're beginning to influence the way people think about monitoring, both in Indonesia and elsewhere. And the important thing about this is that we're trying to do more than simply share findings. We're trying to enable others to do this work. So all of our methods, our databases, everything is online. Eventually the data will be there too for everyone to just use and explore and answer questions. So what are we learning? Well, this for us and in the marine sector is proof of concept. We've demonstrated that it's possible to go beyond simply telling stories about MPAs. We're able to detect both absolute change in local communities and begin to detect MPA impacts. And we have some early signs that those impacts may vary. So one thing that's very surprising to us has been the speed at which these impacts have occurred. In conventional thinking around MPAs, people talk about a 5 to 10 year time horizon. And we're seeing significant changes at 2 years. So that may help reframe how we think about how these interventions provide benefits to communities. And we also begin to see things like unintended consequences. And finally, one thing that we found, at least within the marine sector, is that it's a virtuous cycle. Once you begin to have data, people want more of it. Once you begin to have findings on impact, people want more. And so we're seeing this virtuous cycle and demand to replicate this work elsewhere. So finally, as I alluded to, I'm not the person that collects all the data. All of the credit has to go to this team of wonderful people who literally hike over mountains to get this stuff. So we're in their debt. Thank you.